The day my boss tried to destroy me started with a lie, and it ended with him disappearing from the company he thought he owned. Julian Thorin fired me in front of half the management team and called it a necessary correction. According to him, I had violated internal policy. According to everyone else in that room, I had just made the mistake of standing between a Wall Street CEO and the $2.1 million he wanted to strip from our workers' overtime pay. So before we continue, you can make yourself a hot cup of tea and listen to the rest of this story with me. Don't forget to let me know in the comments where you were listening from tonight. If stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing. Each subscription helps these stories reach a little further, and somewhere out there, it might give someone the courage they need to stand their ground. My name is Leora Kerr, and for nearly 18 years, I had been the union chief steward at our industrial components plant. 420 workers trusted me to do one thing: make sure executives couldn't gamble with their safety, their wages, or their dignity. Julian Thorin hated that. He arrived 6 months earlier with the kind of resume that made investors cheer and employees nervous buy companies, slash costs, flip them for profit. In his very first leadership meeting, he said something that told me exactly how things were going to go. Labor contracts are negotiable, he said. Profit is not. 3 weeks after I blocked his plan to eliminate weekend overtime across the plant, he stared at me across the conference table and said quietly, "You've been slowing this company down for years." 2 hours later, security escorted me out. Official reason: violation of internal policy. Unofficial reason: I refused to let him take money out of 400 paychecks. I packed 18 years of work into a cardboard box and walked out of the factory I had helped protect. For a moment, I thought the humiliation was the worst part. It wasn't. 2 days later, a legal envelope arrived at my house. The company wasn't just firing me, they were suing me. $5.6 million in damages. I read every page slowly, then leaned back in my chair and laughed under my breath. Because there was one small detail Julian Thorin didn't know. 3 months before he fired me, I had already started saving his emails. Some parts of the story ahead are dramatized and supported by AI to make the narrative clearer and more engaging. It is created purely for storytelling and educational purposes and does not represent any real person or organization. I hope you enjoy the story. 18 years is a long time to give a company. Long enough to watch the walls get repainted 3 times, the machines replaced twice, and entire management teams come and go like passing storms. When I first walked into that factory, I was just another line worker tightening bolts on metal housings. I didn't know anything about contracts or labor law. What I knew was that the people next to me worked hard, and they deserved someone willing to speak up when things went wrong. Over time, that someone became me. I worked my way up slowly, first a shift representative, then a committee member, and eventually the union chief steward. I'm not going to pretend it was glamorous. Most of the work happened in windowless rooms, arguing over numbers while managers stared at spreadsheets like they were sacred text. But those arguments mattered. In 18 years, we negotiated a total wage increase of about 13% for the workers on the floor. That meant hundreds of families could pay mortgages, send kids to college, and sleep a little easier at night. We also forced the company to overhaul its safety systems after 2 fatal accidents shook the plant. Those were hard months, angry meetings, long investigations, but the upgrades we pushed through probably saved lives later. And when corporate tried to quietly eliminate a $3 million healthcare plan during a cost optimization review, we stopped that too. For a long time, I was proud of that record. Then Julian Thorin arrived. He was the opposite of everything our plant had ever been built on. Julian didn't talk about people, he talked about metrics. Every meeting had charts, projections, and efficiency graphs glowing on the conference room screen. To him, workers were just line items. During one internal leadership meeting, he leaned back in his chair and said something that stuck with me. The fastest way to fix labor costs is to remove resistance. At first, it sounded like another corporate cliché, but within weeks, strange things started happening. Union supporters were reassigned to worse shifts. Some had their hours cut without explanation. A few simply disappeared from the schedule. Then one evening, an internal email landed in my inbox by mistake. The first line read, "If we remove Kerr, the rest of the union collapses." For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen, convinced the message had to be some kind of mistake. Internal emails drift through corporate servers all the time. But this one felt different the instant I read the first line. My name was there, written with a casual certainty that made my stomach tighten. The message hadn't been meant for me. In fact, judging from the distribution list, it had been sent to 32 mid-level managers across the company. Somehow, it had landed in my inbox anyway. I leaned closer to the monitor and read it again. The sender was Julian Thorin. That alone was enough to make my pulse quicken. CEOs don't usually write operational strategy emails themselves. They let legal departments and consultants do the dirty work. But Julian had written this one personally. And the subject line sat there like a warning flare. Union neutralization strategy. The phrase didn't sound like the kind of corporate language designed for polite boardroom presentations. It sounded blunt, almost aggressive. I scrolled slowly, forcing myself not to jump to conclusions. After 18 years in that plant, I had learned that suspicion without proof was useless. If I was going to understand what Julian was doing, I needed to read every word carefully. The message opened with a paragraph explaining that labor costs had become structurally unsustainable and that decisive action was required to bring them under control before the company's planned restructuring. That part wasn't surprising. Executives had been complaining about labor costs for years, but then the email shifted tone. Instead of general discussion, it outlined a step-by-step strategy. Step 1, remove the union chief steward. I didn't have to guess who that meant. Step 2, eliminate weekend overtime programs across all production units. Step 3, restructure shift assignments to reduce full-time labor hours. Step 4, introduce temporary contract workers to replace non-essential union positions. I sat back in my chair and felt a slow wave of disbelief settle over me. This wasn't just a list of cost-cutting ideas. It was a plan to dismantle the union's influence piece by piece. At the bottom of the section, one line summarized the entire goal. Projected savings, $14 million in annual labor expenses. $14 million. The number hung there like a price tag attached to every worker on the production floor. For a minute, I just listened to the quiet hum of the office around me. Outside my small union office window, forklifts moved pallets across the loading yard. People were working their normal shifts, unaware that someone upstairs had just written a blueprint for stripping away their protections. That was the moment suspicion hardened into something else. Discovery. I didn't reply to the email. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I did the one thing that felt instinctively right. I saved it. Then I created a folder on my computer and labeled it with a simple name. Thorin. Inside that folder, I stored the email exactly as it had arrived, complete with the original metadata showing the sender, recipients, and timestamp. Years of dealing with labor disputes had taught me that documentation mattered more than outrage. If Julian Thorin wanted to put his strategy in writing, I was going to preserve every word before closing the message. Though, I noticed something else. At the bottom of the email was a small attachment icon. I clicked it open. A document appeared on the screen, an internal meeting record from a management strategy session held 2 weeks earlier. As I skimmed through the pages, the tone became even clearer. Executives discussed labor resistance, scheduling manipulation, and the importance of removing central leadership obstacles. In other words, me. By the time I reached the final page, the room around me felt strangely quiet, because the email itself was already dangerous. But the meeting record attached to it made one thing absolutely clear. This wasn't just a theory Julian Thorin had typed into an email. It was a plan they had already started putting into motion. After I discovered the email outlining the union neutralization strategy, I stopped thinking like an angry employee and started thinking like someone building a case. Anger is loud, But evidence is quiet. Quiet things last longer. That night, sitting alone in the small office the union used near the back of the administrative wing, I created a new folder on my computer and gave it a simple name, Thorin, Internal Records. At first, it held only the one email I had accidentally received, but something about the tone of that message told me there was more behind it. Plans like that don't appear overnight. They grow inside conference rooms, spreadsheets, and private conversations long before anyone sends an email about them. So I began paying attention in ways I hadn't before, over the next few days. I started quietly saving anything connected to executive decision-making, internal emails, meeting summaries, draft memos that circulated between departments. Most of the time, it felt routine, just corporate chatter about production schedules and cost projections. But every now and then, a sentence or phrase would appear that hinted at the bigger strategy. When that happened, the document went straight into the folder. Weeks passed. I never mentioned it to anyone. Outwardly, nothing about my behavior changed. I still attended meetings, still negotiated overtime disputes, still walked the production floor during lunch breaks to check in with workers. Inside. Though, the folder kept growing. By the end of the first month, it held dozens of files, emails from management discussing staffing flexibility, internal memos about restructuring weekend shifts, notes from budget meetings where labor expenses were described as structural obstacles to future valuation. Every piece alone looked harmless. Together, they told a story, one evening after everyone had left for the day. I opened the folder again and counted what was inside. 87 emails, 9 meeting records, several short internal memorandums written by department heads trying to interpret Julian Thorin's directives. I scrolled slowly through the list of file names. Reading them one by one, patterns were starting to emerge. Certain managers appeared repeatedly in the correspondence. Certain phrases showed up again and again: cost pressure, labor efficiency, union leverage. The more I read, the clearer it became that the plan I had seen in that original email wasn't theoretical. Pieces of it were already moving quietly through the organization. Then, one message caught my attention immediately. The sender was Julian Thorin himself, unlike most of the documents I had collected. This one wasn't carefully worded. It looked like a quick response to a question from a plant operations manager about safety procedures slowing down production output. Julian's reply was only a few sentences long, but one line stood out. Safety rules are negotiable if productivity increases. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Most executives are cautious when writing about safety. Even the aggressive ones understand that certain things should never be said in plain text. But Julian had written it as if it were the most reasonable statement in the world. I saved the email immediately and added it to the folder. At that moment, I still thought of it as just another piece of evidence showing the mindset behind the company's new leadership. It was troubling, yes, but not yet explosive. What I didn't realize until later was the timing. The email had been sent 3 weeks earlier, 3 weeks before a serious accident on the production floor. A maintenance technician had been injured when a machine guard failed during a late shift. At the time, management described it as an unfortunate mechanical malfunction. Investigations were mentioned, but details were vague. Looking back at the timestamp on Julian's message, the connection felt suddenly heavier, because that email about negotiable safety rules hadn't been written after the accident. It had been written before it. If you think I was right to quietly save those emails and documents instead of confronting them immediately, leave a 1 in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. Sometimes speaking up is exactly what gives someone else the courage to stand their ground. The accident happened on a Tuesday night during the late production shift. I wasn't in the plant when it occurred, but by the time I arrived the next morning, the entire place felt different. People spoke more quietly. Supervisors stood in small groups, whispering near the loading bay. The usual rhythm of machines and forklifts was still there, but something underneath it had changed. A maintenance technician named Carlos had been injured while servicing one of the stamping presses. According to the first reports, a safety guard had malfunctioned and the machine activated before the lockout procedure was fully completed. Carlos survived, but the injury was serious enough that an ambulance had taken him straight to the hospital. Accidents in heavy manufacturing aren't unheard of, but they are supposed to trigger strict reporting procedures. Federal OSHA regulations require immediate documentation, internal review, and in some cases, external notification. Those rules exist for a reason. Yet as the morning unfolded, something about management's response felt off. During the first supervisors' meeting of the day, I noticed how quickly the conversation shifted away from the incident, instead of discussing safety protocols. The plant manager focused on production targets and delivery deadlines. Then someone asked a direct question. "Do we need to report this yet?" The room went quiet for a second. Later that afternoon, a short internal message circulated among department heads. I didn't receive it directly, but by that point, I had already learned where to look. The message came from Julian Thorin. It was brief, only 2 sentences. "Handle the situation internally. Keep this quiet until we review the numbers." I leaned back in my chair and felt the tension tighten across my shoulders. The words weren't complicated, but they carried weight. Reporting a workplace injury isn't optional. Ignoring federal safety procedures isn't a strategic decision. It's a legal risk that can cost companies millions. And that's when I remembered the email I had saved weeks earlier. The one where Julian wrote that safety rules were negotiable if productivity increases. I opened the folder again and pulled the message up on my screen. The timestamp stared back at me. 3 weeks before the accident. For a moment, I just sat there, connecting the pieces slowly. An executive willing to bend safety rules. A serious injury on the production floor. A direct order from the CEO telling managers to keep quiet. The implications were impossible to ignore. If federal regulators ever investigated that chain of decisions, the company wouldn't just face criticism. OSHA penalties alone could reach several $1 million, depending on how violations were classified, but instead of confronting anyone, I did what I had been doing for weeks. I documented everything. The internal message went straight into the Thorin internal records folder. Then I saved additional meeting notes, departmental responses, and every related email I could find. Each document felt like another piece of a puzzle that was slowly forming a picture. Outwardly, I stayed calm. Inside, the tension kept building, because the more information I gathered, the clearer the pattern became. Julian Thorin wasn't reacting to events. He was pushing the organization toward decisions that placed profit above every safeguard that had protected workers for years. And he seemed confident no one would challenge him. One evening, while reviewing new files in the folder, I noticed something unusual attached to a management meeting summary. At first, it looked like a standard document link, but when I opened the file, a small audio icon appeared at the top of the screen. I clicked it out of curiosity. Voices filled the quiet office. It was a recording from a closed-door management meeting held earlier that week. I recognized several supervisors immediately. Then another voice cut through the background conversation. "Julian Thorin." He was speaking clearly, without hesitation. As I listened, a slow realization settled in. The emails I had collected were already serious, but this recording was something else entirely. Because unlike an email, a recorded conversation captures exactly what someone says when they think the room is private. The pressure began the moment the lawsuit papers arrived on my kitchen table. I had barely finished reading the complaint before the weight of what the company was trying to do settled in. They weren't just firing me, they were trying to bury me. $5.6 million. That was the number printed across the claim for damages, according to the company's attorneys. My actions as union chief steward had supposedly disrupted production, encouraged workers to resist management decisions, and caused financial harm to the business. The accusation was absurd, but absurd accusations can still destroy people if the right lawyers stand behind them. For the first few hours, I sat at the table staring at the documents. The pages smelled faintly of printer ink and legal formatting dense paragraphs, numbered claims, references to internal policies and alleged violations. Whoever had drafted the complaint knew exactly how to make it sound intimidating. And it worked. Not because I believed the accusations, but because I understood what the company was trying to accomplish. A lawsuit like that wasn't just about money, it was about pressure. If they could frighten me enough, if they could make me worry about losing my home, my savings, my future, then maybe I would quietly step away and disappear. Julian Thorne was counting on that. But after the initial shock faded, another feeling replaced it: focus. I cleared the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and returned to the folder that had been growing for weeks. Thorne, internal records. If the company wanted to turn this into a legal fight, then I needed to think the way legal fights actually worked. Courts didn't care about rumors or anger. They cared about documentation, timelines, and provable intent. Fortunately, I had already been collecting exactly that. Over the next several days, the pressure intensified. A second package arrived from the company's attorneys. This one contained hundreds of pages of legal filings and procedural notices. It was obvious what they were trying to do: overwhelm me with paperwork before the process even began. Reading through it felt like walking into a storm of technical language: citations from labor statutes, corporate policy manuals, witness lists that included several managers who had always treated union representatives like enemies. But buried inside all of that legal noise was something the lawyers didn't seem to understand. They were assuming I had nothing. Every argument in their complaint rested on the idea that I had acted recklessly, without justification, and without evidence of wrongdoing by the company. That assumption made their case sound strong. It also made it dangerously fragile, because the more documents they sent me, the more carefully I began reviewing the material already stored in my folder. I built timelines showing when Julian's emails were written and when management decisions followed. I cross-referenced meeting notes with internal messages about overtime reductions and shift changes. Slowly, the structure of their accusations started to weaken. One evening, while comparing the lawsuit's timeline with the internal documents I had saved, something unusual caught my attention. The complaint claimed that I had interfered with company operations on a specific date the same week the accident involving Carlos had occurred. According to their version of events, my union activities had caused disruption that justified my termination, but the documents in my folder told a different story. 3 weeks before that date, Julian Thorne had already circulated the email outlining the plan to remove me and dismantle union influence. In other words, the decision to eliminate me hadn't been a reaction to anything I had done. It had been planned in advance. I leaned back in my chair and read the 2 timelines again. One timeline came from the company's lawsuit. The other came from their own internal communications. They didn't match, and that was the moment the pressure shifted. Because if the evidence showed that the company had targeted me before the alleged misconduct even occurred, the entire legal argument could collapse. I stared at the screen for a long moment, realizing what I had just found. Julian Thorne hadn't just fired me. He had built a lawsuit on top of a timeline that his own emails could contradict, a week after I discovered the contradiction in the company's timeline. Another letter arrived, this one from the Regional Labor Arbitration Office. Unlike the lawsuit documents, it was short and direct. The agency had reviewed the initial filings and determined that the dispute would proceed to formal arbitration. In other words, the fight was now real. I sat at my kitchen table reading the notice twice, letting the weight of it settle in. Arbitration isn't a casual meeting where people talk things out over coffee. It's structured, documented, and binding. Once the process begins, both sides present their evidence, their arguments, and their witnesses. Then someone neutral decides who is telling the truth. The hearing date was scheduled 6 weeks away. 6 weeks. That wasn't much time, especially considering the scale of the case the company was building against me. They had lawyers, resources, and an entire corporate legal department behind them. I had my laptop, a stack of printed emails, and 18 years of experience understanding how management actually operated. Still, something inside me stayed calm, because while I might have been alone, I wasn't unprepared. Within days of the arbitration notice, the company's legal strategy began to take shape. Through official filings and discovery requests, I could see the outline of what they were planning. They were assembling a legal team that specialized in corporate labor disputes, people whose job was to dismantle union arguments piece by piece, even without seeing them yet. I could imagine the type of attorneys Julian Thorin would hire. Confident, methodical, the kind who speak in precise legal language, designed to sound overwhelming to anyone outside their profession. Their first move confirmed exactly that. A thick packet of procedural documents arrived, requesting additional information about my actions as Union Chief Steward. They asked for records of every grievance I had filed, every negotiation meeting I had attended, and every communication I had made with workers regarding overtime policy. On the surface, it looked routine, but I recognized the tactic immediately. They weren't just collecting information, they were building pressure. The more paperwork they demanded, the more they hoped I would feel outmatched before the hearing even began. A single person fighting a corporation rarely looks like a fair contest, especially when legal teams start filling the room. That realization made the tension slowly build over the following weeks. Every day brought another small reminder of what was coming. Another document request, another formal notice, another indication that the company was preparing to defend its actions aggressively. Meanwhile, rumors from inside the plant began reaching me through old coworkers. Managers were holding closed-door meetings. Human Resources was coordinating with outside counsel. And Julian Thorin, according to several sources, was confident the arbitration would end quickly. He thinks it's already decided. One supervisor told me quietly over the phone. I didn't argue with him. From the outside, it probably did look that way. The company had lawyers. I had a laptop. But every evening, after the paperwork was finished and the house grew quiet, I returned to the folder on my computer that had started this entire chain of events. Thorin, internal records. I reviewed each email again, checking timestamps and recipients. I organized the documents into timelines showing when Julian's directives were issued and how management responded. I cross-referenced them with the accident report, the internal safety message, and the meeting records attached to the original union neutralization strategy. Slowly, the evidence became more structured, more precise, more dangerous. Because what the company's attorneys didn't realize, what none of them could possibly know yet, was that the internal emails I had collected weren't stored in only one place. The folder on my laptop was just the working copy. Weeks earlier, after discovering the first message, I had quietly backed up every document, multiple copies, different locations, time-stamped and preserved exactly as they had originally appeared. So while Julian Thorin's lawyers were preparing to argue their case, they were walking into the hearing with one critical misunderstanding. They believed the company controlled the evidence. They had no idea the entire trail of internal emails had already been saved. The morning of the arbitration arrived sooner than I expected, even after weeks of preparation. The drive to the labor office felt strangely quiet. The building itself was plain gray concrete, narrow windows, and a lobby that smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. It wasn't the kind of place where dramatic victories usually happened. It was the kind of place where disputes were slowly dismantled through documents, testimony, and careful questions. I arrived early and took a seat near the conference room where the hearing would be held. The folder containing my printed evidence rested in my bag beside me. Over the past several weeks, I had reviewed those documents so many times that I could almost recite the key emails from memory. Still, knowing something and proving it are two very different things. About 10 minutes before the scheduled start, the hallway door opened and Julian Thorin walked in. He looked exactly the same as he had on the day he fired me. Tailored suit, confident posture, the kind of expression executives wear when they believe the outcome of a situation has already been decided. But this time, he wasn't alone. 3 lawyers followed him into the hallway. They were from Carter and Doyle, one of the largest corporate law firms in the region. I recognized the name immediately. Their reputation in labor disputes was simple. They rarely lost. The first lawyer carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my first car. The second walked in with a thick stack of legal binders under his arm. The third, a woman with a tablet and several folders, spoke quietly with Julian as they approached the conference room. For a moment, The size of the team felt deliberate. 4 professionals on one side of the table, one former union steward on the other. Julian noticed me sitting there and paused. A small smile crossed his face as he adjusted the cuff of his jacket. "You should have settled," he said casually. The words weren't loud, but they carried the same quiet confidence I remembered from the day he dismissed me. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I simply looked at him for a moment, letting the silence sit between us. Then I stood and walked into the conference room. Inside, the layout was simple: a long table, several chairs, a digital recorder placed in the center, and a neutral arbitrator already reviewing preliminary documents. No jury, no audience, just people, paper, and the truth waiting to be argued. Julian and his legal team took seats together on one side. Their binders opened almost immediately, pages filled with printed statutes, case citations, and company policies highlighted in bright yellow. It was obvious they had come prepared to present a structured, aggressive case. Watching them organize their materials, I understood exactly what they were trying to do. Intimidation. Not crude intimidation, no raised voices or threats. The kind used in corporate disputes is quieter. It works by overwhelming the other side with expertise, paperwork, and the unspoken message that professionals have already taken control of the situation. To most people, sitting across from 3 experienced attorneys would feel like walking into a storm. But as the hearing officially began, something about the moment felt strangely calm, because the lawyers were preparing to argue a narrative built entirely on one assumption: that the company's version of events was the only version supported by evidence. The arbitrator invited the company to begin. One of the attorneys stood and started outlining their position with confident precision. According to their argument, my actions as union chief steward had interfered with operational decisions, encouraged employee resistance, and caused measurable financial disruption. Their explanation was polished, logical, carefully rehearsed. It probably sounded convincing to anyone hearing it for the first time. When the attorney finished speaking, the arbitrator turned toward me. "Ms. Kerr," he said, "you may respond." I didn't start with a speech. Instead, I reached down into my bag and removed the thick folder I had been carrying all morning. The documents inside represented weeks of quiet preparation emails, meeting records, and internal messages carefully organized by date and subject. Without saying anything dramatic, I placed the entire stack on the table in front of the arbitrator. The sound of the paper landing was soft, but the weight of what was inside that folder had the potential to change everything. The room was quiet after I placed the folder on the table. Not tense yet, just still. The arbitrator glanced down at the stack of documents, then back at me, clearly curious about what I intended to present. Across from me, Julian Thorne leaned back in his chair with the same relaxed confidence he had shown all morning. His lawyers barely reacted. To them, it probably looked like a former union steward bringing a pile of complaints into a legal hearing. But this wasn't a pile of complaints. It was a record. I opened the folder slowly and pulled out the first document. "This," I said, sliding the page toward the arbitrator, "is an internal company email." The arbitrator adjusted his glasses and began reading. One of the attorneys from Carter and Doyle leaned forward as well, clearly wanting to see the page before it was discussed further. At the top of the document was the sender, Julian Thorne. The subject line below it read, "Union Neutralization Strategy." Then came the first sentence. "If we remove Kerr, the rest of the union collapses." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment. Across the table, one of the lawyers shifted in his chair. Another reached toward the document, asking quietly if he could review the page. The arbitrator handed it over without comment. The attorney read the lines silently. Then again, the confident rhythm that had filled the room earlier suddenly disappeared. Instead of prepared arguments and polished explanations, there was now a pause, an uncomfortable one. I watched them carefully as they began flipping through the first few pages of the folder. The documents were arranged in chronological order: the original email, the list of recipients, the attached strategy outline describing how management intended to weaken the union's influence inside the plant. One lawyer cleared his throat and glanced briefly toward Julian. Julian didn't move, but I noticed something small in the way his posture shifted. The easy confidence from earlier had tightened just slightly. The arbitrator finally spoke. "Ms. Kerr," he said, tapping the document lightly. "You're stating that this message was distributed internally before your termination." "Yes," I answered calmly. "3 weeks before." The arbitrator nodded and continued reading. Meanwhile, the attorneys were already moving deeper into the folder. Their pages turned faster now. A second email, a meeting summary, a management memo referencing labor cost reduction strategies. The silence in the room grew heavier with each document they examined. Shock doesn't always come with raised voices. Sometimes it arrives quietly. When people realize the story they were prepared to tell no longer fits the evidence in front of them. After several minutes, the lead attorney placed the email back on the table. "Even if this email exists," he began carefully, "it doesn't necessarily establish wrongdoing. Corporations routinely discuss restructuring strategies." I nodded. "That's true," I said. Then I slid another document forward. This email was sent to 32 managers across the company. It outlines a plan to remove union leadership before implementing labor reductions. The arbitrator reviewed the page again. Julian's legal team leaned in closer. Their earlier composure now replaced with quiet concentration. They were no longer performing for the room. They were analyzing. The shock hadn't come from one document. It had come from realizing there might be many more. For a moment, no one spoke. The arbitrator placed the email back onto the stack and folded his hands. "And this is the primary evidence you wish to present?" he asked. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. Then I rested my hand on the folder. The attorneys looked up again, waiting, because by that point they had already understood something important. The email they were reading wasn't just embarrassing for the company, it was dangerous, and it was only the beginning. I took a slow breath and looked directly at them. "That's not even the worst part," for a few seconds after I said. "That's not even the worst part." No one in the room spoke. The attorneys from Carter and Doyle exchanged brief glances. The kind lawyers give each other when they are silently recalculating the direction of a case. Julian Thorin remained still in his chair, though the confidence that had filled the room earlier had begun to fade. I opened the folder again and reached for the next piece of evidence. "This," I said, placing a small USB drive on the table, "is a recording from a management meeting held 2 weeks before my termination." The arbitrator raised his eyebrows slightly. "A recording, yes," I replied. "An internal strategy meeting." One of the attorneys immediately leaned forward. "We would like clarification regarding the origin of that recording," he said carefully. "You'll have it," I answered. "But first, I believe everyone should hear it." The arbitrator nodded and signaled for the digital recorder on the table to be connected to the device. A moment later, the audio file loaded, and the small speaker in the center of the table began to play. At first, the recording sounded ordinary chairs shifting, papers moving, quiet conversation among managers preparing for a meeting. Then a familiar voice entered the room. Julian Thorin. Even before the words became clear, the tone was unmistakable, confident, impatient, and completely certain that the room belonged to him. "We've spent too long pretending the union is a partner," the recording said. There was a brief pause. Then Julian continued, "We don't negotiate with unions. We break them." The words echoed through the conference room. No one moved, for the first time since the hearing began. The silence felt electric. Across the table, one of the Carter and Doyle attorneys slowly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Another leaned closer to the speaker, as if hoping he had misheard the sentence. But the recording continued. Julian's voice explained the strategy: plainly remove union leadership, restructure labor hours, and reduce overtime programs before employees could organize resistance. Every sentence confirmed what the emails had already suggested. The plan wasn't hypothetical, it was deliberate. When the recording stopped, The room remained still for several seconds. Even the air conditioner humming in the corner sounded louder than before. The arbitrator finally spoke. "Ms. Kerr," he said calmly, "can you confirm the date of this meeting?" "Yes," I replied. "2 weeks before my termination." One of the attorneys quickly flipped through his notes, clearly searching for something. Another whispered quietly to Julian. I could see tension spreading across their side of the table, like cracks forming in glass. Julian himself said nothing, but his jaw tightened. The lead attorney straightened in his chair and attempted to regain control of the conversation. "Even if this recording exists," he began, "context matters. Corporate strategy discussions often involve aggressive language before he could finish. The arbitrator raised a hand. "I understand that," he said. "However, the language used here appears directly related to the employment action being disputed." The attorney nodded stiffly. Then the arbitrator turned back toward me. "You mentioned earlier there were additional documents," he said. "Yes," I replied. The tension in the room rose again as I reached into the folder. Because the recording alone had already shaken the company's argument, but the next document connected something far more serious. I pulled out a printed email and slid it across the table. "This message," I explained, "was sent by Mr. Thorin shortly before a serious workplace injury occurred." The arbitrator read the line silently. Then his expression changed. He looked up slowly. "Counsel," he said, addressing the attorneys, "I would like to examine this safety-related communication in detail." The lawyers leaned forward immediately, their earlier confidence replaced with visible concern, because the email contained a single sentence that suddenly reframed the entire dispute. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood the same thing. The case was no longer only about my termination, it was about safety. The moment the arbitrator began reading the safety email, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. Until then, the hearing had felt like a difficult labor dispute, serious, certainly, but still contained within the normal boundaries of arbitration. What lay on the table now was something much larger. The arbitrator read the sentence silently first. Then he read it again, out loud. "Safety rules are negotiable if productivity increases." Hearing those words spoken aloud carried a weight that the printed page alone could not. The sentence sounded colder, more reckless, when it left someone else's mouth. Across the table, Julian Thorin's legal team reacted immediately. One attorney leaned forward and asked to review the email more closely. Another began flipping quickly through the documents in front of him, as if searching for anything that might soften the meaning of that line. Their movements had lost the careful composure they carried earlier. What replaced it was urgency, because everyone in that room understood the implications. Ignoring workplace safety procedures isn't simply poor management. Under federal regulations, it can trigger serious consequences if investigators determine that leadership knowingly encouraged unsafe practices. Penalties from OSHA can escalate quickly, depending on the classification of the violation. Fines can reach several $1,000,000. $8 to $10 million wasn't an unrealistic estimate. The arbitrator looked up from the page and turned toward the attorneys. "Counsel," he said evenly, "can you explain how this communication relates to the workplace injury reported shortly afterward?" The question hung in the air. For the first time that morning, no one from Carter and Doyle answered immediately. Instead, the three attorneys leaned toward one another and began speaking in low voices. Their earlier confidence had vanished. The careful rhythm of their arguments had been replaced with hurried whispers and exchanged notes. Julian Thorin remained silent, but his expression had changed. The calm certainty he had worn at the start of the hearing had cracked. His eyes moved quickly between the documents on the table and the attorneys beside him, as if he were trying to calculate how much damage had just been done. From my side of the table, the room suddenly felt crowded with tension. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused anyone of criminal wrongdoing. All I had done was present the company's own words, and those words were now echoing in a room where they could not easily be ignored. One of the attorneys finally cleared his throat. "We would like a brief recess," he said carefully. The arbitrator considered the request for a moment, then nodded. 10 minutes. Chairs shifted as the session paused. The legal team gathered their documents quickly and moved toward the far side of the room. Their conversation stayed quiet, but their body language spoke clearly enough. Shoulders leaned inward. Hands moved rapidly across pages. One lawyer pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway. Chaos doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like professionals scrambling to control a situation that is slipping away. I remained seated where I was, watching the room settle into an uneasy silence. The folder containing the emails and recordings rested in front of me. For weeks, those documents had existed only on my laptop, quietly waiting for the moment they would matter. Now they mattered more than I had expected. After several minutes, the Carter and Doyle attorneys returned to the table. Their expressions had changed again this time from panic to something more measured. The lead attorney spoke first. "Ms. Kerr," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Before the hearing continues, our client would like to discuss a possible resolution." The arbitrator raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting settlement?" The attorney nodded slightly. "We believe it may be in everyone's interest to resolve the dispute without further proceedings." I sat back in my chair and let the meaning of that statement settle in. Only an hour earlier, the company had entered the room convinced they would win. Now they were trying to stop the process entirely, because the evidence in that folder had begun to reveal something Julian Thorne had never planned for. And the company's first response to that discovery was not to fight. It was to start negotiating the withdrawal of their own lawsuit, 2 weeks after the arbitration hearing. The storm that had surrounded my life for months finally began to settle. The first sign came in the form of a short, formal notice delivered by the company's legal department. The document was surprisingly simple compared to the mountain of paperwork they had sent earlier. It stated that the company was withdrawing its lawsuit in full and would not pursue further legal action. Just like that, the $5.6 million claim against me disappeared. Not long after, my attorney called to confirm that the company had also agreed to a financial settlement. The exact details were confidential, but the agreement included compensation for the wrongful termination and legal pressure they had tried to place on me, for the first time since the day I was fired. I slept through the entire night without waking up to replay arguments in my head. But the story didn't end there. A few days later, another letter arrived, this one from the Federal Labor Safety Office. After reviewing the evidence that surfaced during arbitration, investigators had opened a formal inquiry into the company's safety practices. That investigation moved quietly, but the consequences were anything but small. Inside the company, the board of directors had already started asking questions. The combination of internal emails, recorded meetings, and safety concerns created a situation that investors and executives simply couldn't ignore. Within days, the final piece of news reached me through a former coworker. Julian Thorne had resigned. No announcement, no press statement, just a brief internal memo explaining that he was stepping down to pursue other opportunities. I couldn't help smiling when I heard that. A week later, I stopped by the plant to meet a few friends after their shift ended. Standing near the parking lot, one of the younger workers looked at me with curiosity. "So," he asked, "how did you beat them?" I thought about that question for a moment. Then I shrugged and smiled. "I didn't beat them," I said. "I just kept their emails. There's something I learned through all of this that doesn't show up in legal documents or arbitration transcripts. Most conflicts at work don't begin with dramatic confrontations. They begin quietly. When someone decides it's easier to stay silent than to question something that feels wrong. In my case, the turning point wasn't the hearing or the lawyers. It was the moment I chose to save those emails instead of pretending they didn't exist. Small decisions like that matter more than we realize. They build the foundation for truth later. What I hope this story leaves you thinking about is simple. What would you do in that moment? If you saw something unfair happening around you, something that could hurt people who trust the system, would you step forward? Or would you step aside? There isn't always an easy answer, but sometimes courage looks less like fighting and more like quietly refusing to ignore what you know is wrong. I'm curious where you're listening from right now. Tell me in the comments. Stories like this travel farther than we expect, and every place they reach means someone else might hear a reminder that integrity still matters. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing to the channel. A single subscription might seem small, but it helps these conversations reach more people. Your comment, your like, or your share could be the reason someone else finds the courage to stand their ground. In a way, that makes you part of the story too, and part of helping the right things travel a little farther. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.